So hello, everyone, and welcome to our expert series on offshore wind. We're going to speak to the promises and challenges of offshore wind in New England. We're pleased to welcome Eric Hines as our speaker today. Eric is directs the Offshore Wind Energy Graduate Program at Tufts University. He has over 25 years of experience engineering innovative infrastructure, has major offshore wind-related projects, including the Wind Technology Testing Center in Charleston, the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal, the Partnership for Offshore Wind Energy Research, the digital twinning the Block Island wind farm, I may have mispronounced that, and many other relevant areas of background. We also have Tony Rogers, who will be our moderator today. Tony also has a strong background in wind and offshore wind. Tony was a researcher in the UMass Wind Energy Center for many years, co-wrote a book on wind turbine design and engineering, was the lead technical author of the state's successful proposal for the Wind Technology Testing Center in Charlestown, Mass., and worked for an international wind energy consulting firm for a number of years. So with that, I'll turn it over to Tony.
Yeah, well, welcome everyone. It's great to have you here. Before I go over the rules and how we're going to do this, I will add that I forgot to put it in my bio there, but Eric and I have worked together on some of the design details of the blade test facility. That's where I met him, and he's quite an excellent engineer in my mind. So what we're going to do is Eric is going to start in just 1 minute. But we're going to go, he's going to be speaking for a while. I'm going to be moderating, but there will be 2 places in Eric's presentation, which it's important to sort of get through to get the whole package. And then we'll have time for questions afterwards, but there will be 2 places during his presentation where he will stop. And I will entertain clarifying questions at that point so that we'll make sure that everyone's still on the same page as the presentation goes forward. So Eric, you're on. Thank you for being here.
It's my pleasure. Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Arnie. It's really great to be here with everyone. It's nice to see all of you, and thank you for joining us today. I'm going to share my screen and hope I can just get a thumbs up once people see it. Can folks see that?
Yep.
All right, excellent. Let's see. And I'm just going to do a couple other things here. Pull up the chat and the participants. Okay. So Arnie came up with the title for this presentation, which I really like. It is The Promise and Challenge of Offshore Wind in New England. And if you see me looking to my left, that's the screen I'm sharing. So I'm just looking at my slides as we move through this. And so that's what we want to talk about, is how do we fit into the larger picture, and what is our story? And we begin with a story that everybody's pretty familiar with already. A year ago, there was a lot of fanfare in the first blades and towers going out to the Vineyard Wind Farm. And this summer, there was a major failure of one of the blades, which happened at probably the worst possible time anybody could imagine in the high season, and pieces of blade were washing up on Nantucket beaches. And so this is kind of the larger picture of all of this going on at the same time that we're building this new industry and really erecting the largest turbines in the Western Hemisphere as one of the first commercial scale wind farms in the United States. Just earlier last month, there was also kind of this question, the question of public acceptance, really came back to the fore. And then a day later, New England and the governor, the Governor Healy administration announces the largest procurement of offshore wind ever in New England. And so again, we see these really big things happening on all sides of these issues. So it's a very dramatic scene, and there are high highs and low lows, and these go back over a decade, as really over 2 decades, as Massachusetts has been thinking about this industry. And so if we think about this, here's this piece of blade sitting on the beach, and there's a lot of stuff washing up on the beach, and the beaches were closed. And at the same time, the Vineyard Wind Farm was supposed to be able to shut off the lights and have a radar system that could still protect aviation safety and so forth. But the lights are still on. And so there are these various aspects of this wind farm that, aren't quite fully functioning yet. And the question is when people don't know a lot about this and what's going on, what do we make of this and what does it mean? And here we are, bringing the largest machines in the world to within sight of some of these beaches, that have never even contemplated the notion of industrialization or building out, infrastructure inside the ocean. And so this makes again for these dramatic moments. What happened on the Vineyard Wind blade, was an incident in an evolving industry, but it was not an explosion of an oil and gas platform somewhere out in the ocean. And I think the question is for a lot of us is like, how do we sort of hold this in context, and what are we doing and why are we doing it? And how are these things happening and how can we do it better? So let's go back a little bit to last year, October 18th, and Avangrid announces the successful installation of Vineyard Wind 1's first turbine. Again, really big deal, 13 megawatt GE turbines, some of the largest turbines in the Western Hemisphere. These turbines were staged out of the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal. Part of our story at Tufts is that I was the owner's engineer on the New Bedford Marine Commerce Terminal and advised the Mass Clean Energy Center for approximately 5 years on the design and construction of this terminal, and worked with the design team and the contractor and the state to figure out how to build this thing. It's a very exciting project. And we were really doing something new. Even though there were precedents in Europe, we had to reinvent the wheel specifically for the United States. We had to make this terminal Jones Act compliant. We had to design it for the largest landside cranes in the world. New Bedford is a significant Superfund site, so there were contaminated spoils that needed to be dredged. It's also a glacial moraine with shallow bedrock, and you combine all of these things together and you get a very interesting, challenging project for which the design criteria had never been written. And so we had to write the design criteria for these ports. New Bedford became a really cutting edge terminal that is now being used to stage Vineyard Wind. And so here you can see again last year, and you can go down to New Bedford and you can stand on the hurricane barrier and you can get this view, this fascinating view of these wind turbines being staged out of what really is quite a tiny facility. It's about 24 acres landside, compared to the hundreds of hectares that you have in Northern Europe that are staging these offshore wind farms. So one of the names of the game in New England is how do we we have so little coastal real estate available. How do we actually deploy these incredibly large machines in this out of these small areas? And yet, with ingenuity and creativity and a can-do attitude, these things are moving forward and they're happening. A lot of those blades, the blades for the GE turbine were tested in the Wind Technology Testing Center. Now, the one that you could say, well, then why did it break? Best understanding I have is that the blades that were tested in the Wind Technology Testing Center had come from one fabrication facility. The blade that broke had come from another fabrication facility, and GE has assigned that breakage, the explanation of that breakage, to a fabrication flaw. And they've committed to inspecting and reevaluating all of the blades that had come out of that facility. And so this is a developing story, and we can all keep track of this in the news as we move forward. But if anybody had a question, why do we need a facility that actually can test these blades at large scale? Clearly not enough blades were tested in this particular case. You can see why this needs to happen. And this is quite consistent with the norms and the processes in the fields of infrastructure where we're building these large scale structures that need to be understood. How are they going to fail? They need to be understood in a laboratory prior to being deployed. And we do this with bridges and buildings. We do this in earthquake engineering. This is a very well established practice in a lot of industries. This is an industry that grew very fast. These are pictures from 2020. This is the GE blade. The Wind Technology Testing Center, we designed it for a 90-meter blade. I remember asking naively in 2008 or 2009, should we design it for a 100-meter blade? And the whole room erupted into laughter. You know, the punchline being that no one was ever going to see a 100-meter blade, you know, in the next 30 years. And so here we are, not too far into the U.S. offshore wind industry, and along comes a 106-meter blade, and they have to chop off the end and test it in the facility. So this industry has grown at an astonishing rate. It's been really exciting to watch. And also, when things grow this fast, one ought to expect that there will be places where there needs to be a reevaluation and an adjustment. And questions come, you know, what does it mean that we're building these bigger turbines? What are the flaws that are going to be exposed, and how are these going to function, and how are they improved? And so the WTTC and other testing facilities are important because when we're building at this scale, this is the only way, except for literally deploying and seeing what happens, that we can figure out scientifically and on an engineering basis, how do we expect these structures and machines to behave? As I mentioned, this is very consistent with a lot of the work that we do in civil engineering. These are some images from the San Francisco Bay Area. When I was doing my PhD at University of California, San Diego, I was in charge of several tests. One of them you see on the right-hand side of this slide, where we tested the piers that supported the skyway for the new San Francisco-Oakland Bay Bridge at 25% scale under a magnitude 8 earthquake on a San Andreas fault. And so you can see also on this slide, in the yellow arrow, this notion of this bridge was designed to last for 150 years and to survive a 1,500-year earthquake. Right now, the offshore wind industry, by and large, the turbines and the facilities are designed with a 25-year design life in mind. Dominion Energy, which is a vertically integrated utility building the largest offshore wind farm in the United States, the Coastal Virginia Offshore Wind Project, is thinking about 30 to 35 years. But there's no reason why we couldn't be thinking about making these wind farms last for 100 years, 100 plus years. And that is something I'll come back to in a little while. So some of these big questions we need to be asking is that now that we're building this at scale and we're delivering the energy transition, how do we want to do this? And what's the right way to set this up? Again, everything has grown so fast and moved so quickly that I think in many ways we're catching our breath to be able to take a pause and say, okay, how do we want to, now that we know this is happening, how do we want to see it move forward further? So we'll go back to 2023. Several of our students came down in August to watch the deployment of the wind turbines out of New Bedford. And that crane that you see behind you is one of the largest landside cranes that you'll ever see. It's an incredible piece of equipment capable of handling really large loads. And it's really, we feel very good that the Marine Commerce Terminal, although it was designed originally, the design criteria given to us was to stage Cape Wind with 240-ton nacelles for 3.6 megawatt turbines. The terminal is actually successfully staging these 13 megawatt turbines. And that's because coming out of the WTTC experience, we made sure that the design that we chose for the terminal was extremely rugged. And by that, what I mean is that the marginal cost of additional landside capacity was very small. And so we were able to design the terminal to be extremely strong, even though no one in their right mind was contemplating 13 megawatt turbines at the time, 2011, 2011, when this design was being finalized. So we feel good about that. This is a picture in 2015 of the terminal. I'm standing here with Captain Sean Bogus. Captain Bogus was the president of the Marine Pilots Association. As you know, the pilots are responsible for piloting vessels that come from all over the world. When you get to the last few nautical miles before you get to the terminal, the pilot takes over from the captain of the vessel and pilots into New Bedford Harbor and then docks at the terminal. And so we designed the channel in collaboration with the pilots. And you can imagine this turned out to be an example of what we might call competing public goods. The Environmental Protection Agency is interested in minimizing the width of the channel to minimize the environmental disturbance. The owner is interested in minimizing the width of the channel to minimize cost, and the pilots are interested in maximizing the width of the channel to maximize safety. And so these then become discussions and negotiations, out of which ultimately come decisions. And the decisions are often informed by analyses, but I wouldn't say that they're made by analyses. They're made by people sitting and talking and deciding what it is that we want. So this question of what it is that we want and how are we going to approach this remains a really important question in this energy transition. And so Vineyard Wind is staged on, this is September 6th. You can see the barge, what's called a feeder barge, being tugged out of the hurricane barrier of the Marine Commerce Terminal. You cannot fit out of New Bedford Harbor, you cannot fit the large wind turbine installation vessels in a New Bedford Harbor because they won't fit through the hurricane barrier. And so this idea of feeder barges is important twofold. One, because of the hurricane barrier, and then two, because from a Jones Act point of view, you cannot send a foreign flag vessel to the terminal to pick up this equipment, which is why we had to design the land side for the large cranes. And so you can see some of these fantastic photos that were taken by the millwrights and carpenters during the erection of some of the early wind turbines. And here's the nacelle being lifted, an 800-ton nacelle being lifted into place. There's the turbine itself with one of the blades being fastened, and you can see the work is going on 24/7. And there you can see a completed turbine, and the pride that everyone experienced in successfully erecting these really large machines in U.S. waters. And so what is it about offshore wind? A lot of you are very familiar with this. You know, we have our big cities are close to the coast, so there's a lot of load. We have an incredible wind resource in this part of the country. We've been called the Saudi Arabia of wind, and we also have an outer continental shelf that we can use to develop shallow water installations. By shallow water, I mean 90 meters or less. A lot of times that also means 60 meters or less, and this is sort of consistent with North Sea practices. And so offshore wind became a very incredible, very attractive energy resource for this part of the world. If you look at the resource map of the country, with the darker blue being where the velocities are higher and where the wind power potential is higher, you can see that the wind power off the Massachusetts coast is some of the best wind power in the country, land-based and offshore. And we take a look at this and zoom in a little further, and we can see and contemplate that, you know, where the average annual wind speed, this is the average wind speed over the entire year. So sometimes the wind speeds are higher, sometimes they're lower, 9 to 9.9 meters per second. As you go further south, you get closer to 7 meters a second. We recognize that the equation for power in the wind is related to the velocity cubed. And so if you cube 9.9 divided by 7, you get a factor of 2.83. So nearly 3 times the amount of power just from an increase in 3 meters per second. And this is why these velocity numbers are so important. Also, if you look at Massachusetts, you can see that these are our electricity prices a couple of years ago, our retail electricity prices. And our retail electricity prices are nearly 2.5 times higher than the retail prices in North Carolina. We have some of the most expensive electricity in the country. And you can see why investing in offshore wind is affordable for us because of the amount we're already paying. Now, the $259.70 a megawatt hour is always something I've puzzled over, because a lot of my electricity bills in recent memory have been close to $350 a megawatt hour, or 35 cents a kilowatt hour, which is how it comes across. So we pay a lot of money for electricity. Things are much closer to $100 a megawatt hour throughout the rest of the country. And so when you combine our resource with our high electricity prices, with the fact that power plants are retiring and several other characteristics, offshore wind is a very sensible and practical approach to renewable energy in New England, which then became a leader for the entire East Coast. And now we see offshore wind procurements up and down the whole East Coast. And so in 2000, this is a plot of electricity prices, and you can see at the top is Massachusetts, and the prices continue to rise. And we note the 2016 legislation that really kicked this off, that was led by Representative Patricia Haddad and signed into law by Governor Charlie Baker, And at the time, the learning was that market visibility was the essential cost driver. In order to get the cost down, people had to know there was a market and there was something to bid into, and it wasn't just these little 200 or 400 megawatt projects that you saw in different states, but really this was a 1,600 megawatt procurement. And after that 1,600 megawatt commitment by Massachusetts, very soon we see Governor Cuomo in New York committing to 9,000 megawatts. We see Governor Murphy in New Jersey committing to 7,500 megawatts. And so this kicks off ultimately a boom in offshore wind, where we get up to 40 gigawatts of state procurement commitments very quickly within just a couple of years. And so with that said, I'm going to pause just for a moment if anybody wants to check in, and then we're going to zoom out and kind of look at offshore wind inside of the larger energy transition. So I'll go back a slide. Looks like folks are doing all right. I don't see anything in the chat. Tony, are you okay if we proceed?
Yes, I'm okay. Although, let me double check. Arnie, did you have a question?
I don't see Tony, did you mention at the start that folks could also use the raise hand
No.
function?
I failed to do that.
Okay,
So, yes.
I see one hand raised here.
Right. So why don't we start go through the raised hands? The other thing I also did not mention is that questions for Eric at the end of the presentation can be put in the also put in the chat. So there was a hand raise which has been put down, I think. So I think sounds like we're doing okay, Eric. Unless someone wants to quickly put something in the chat and say, hey, wait a sec, somehow you didn't see me.
I have
okay.
a question for Eric, if a little,
Sure.
perhaps
Okay.
a little broader, but it was interesting to see your map a couple slides back on the electric rates for different states on the East Coast, and the difference between Massachusetts and I guess, for example, Virginia. Can you sort of summarize what your understanding is as to why it is that rates in Massachusetts are as high as they are? And even to broaden that a little bit, do you have any crystal ball that says, if we succeed in deploying as much wind energy as has been procured, what will that do to electric rates?
Yeah. Well, my understanding is the way that everybody talks about it, at least at a decision-making level, is that we're at the end of all the energy pipelines. And so it costs money to get the gas to us, to get the electricity, to get whatever resources we're using. It costs money to get them to us. And so another reason that offshore wind felt compelling to a lot of our decision makers is that it was an energy resource that was right next door. It was right off of our shores, and the idea that we could actually potentially produce our own energy. Right now we consume about twice as much energy on electricity on an annual basis as we produce in Massachusetts. And so the idea that we could become energy independent, energy self-sufficient, maybe even an energy exporter, was this new idea that people really hadn't thought about in Massachusetts before. And so that got people excited. More than that, I would say, my understanding of this is relatively superficial. I have seen in my work in transmission, a lot of the work has shown, especially that National Renewable Energy Laboratory has done, that if we could get better interregional transmission, we could share between regions, that one could save on the East Coast about $4 billion a year just by being able to share electricity between the North and the South.
Thank you. And do you have any idea about what the impact of these offshore wind turbines will ultimately be on our cost of electricity?
Well, right now the turbines are expensive. Everybody knew this particular procurement was going to be expensive. mostly, in my opinion, because we failed to build out a supply chain to develop these things domestically. And so if we're able to build out a supply chain and manufacture our own offshore wind, which has always been a goal of every state and of the nation and practically everyone who's gotten involved in this industry, the costs will come down. The other thing is the interest rates went up, and everybody cited inflation, the war in the Ukraine, then the interest rates. And when you look at the cost of money during a construction process where you're not making any money, the difference between a 3.5% debt interest rate and a 6.5% debt rate is enormous and adds a couple $2 billion to the cost of the project. So the capital expenditures, you can assume, say they go up 30% or something, some amount. The cost of wind energy before, the Ukraine war and before all this issue with interest rates and inflation, that we were averaging about $85 a megawatt hour in Massachusetts. Now we're over 100 again. So these things are going to come down. Still I pay $180 a megawatt hour for generation. I opt in my city of Medford to purchase renewable generation. And so we're still at levels that are below anything we see at the retail level. And a lot of the studies are saying that, these original procurements they're not going to have a big impact on anyone's electricity bill. The rate hikes we're seeing right now are big rate hikes in the last couple of years, and they have nothing to do with offshore wind.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Eric. I'm going to quickly answer one question about the driver for such large towers. Basically, one thing Eric hasn't mentioned is not only is the wind speed fastest offshore of New England, but also it's higher up in the sky. The winds are greater than lower down. And on top of that, the larger the rotor, the more energy you can get from one wind turbine. So there's quite a bit of pressure to have very large rotors, and also to have them, then you need a lot of clearance. And that you want higher winds. So they're very large machines, so that they can be more cost effective because the installation costs are great. There was another question here from Rick Johnson about the Gulf of Maine controversy about whales and wind energy. I'm not sure if you're going to address that later, but
I'll make a few comments about whales.
Okay.
Maybe we can talk about that later in the presentation.
Okay. So why don't we, let's see, is there more? There was a question about the crane on the pier in New Bedford. That was a stationary crane. It was not a floating crane. That was used to put all the equipment on the barge, because the barge doesn't have enough room for a crane. So that was indeed, sitting on the ground. Okay, why don't we?
Yeah.
I'll just suspend.
I don't know if you're seeing it,
for the moment.
Tony, but there are 3 folks with their virtual hands up.
Nope. It's
Okay.
so sure. So Pamela Dritt.
How do they handle storms and hurricanes? And can we emphasize that the cost of it now is only going to get lower and lower and lower over time, whereas the cost of fossil fuel generated electricity is bound to go up?
Well, starting
doesn't include the cost of the wind electricity doesn't include the externality damages that we save ourselves from as all of humanity.
Right. Yeah, Pamela, I think you said it very well. And absolutely, the cost is going to go down. And if we build these to last longer, the longer they last, the wind is free. So there's every incentive to build these turbines to last as long as possible. And right now, our notions about financing and even permitting and leasing don't really extend very far beyond 20, 25 years, but we really need to be thinking in 100-year timeframes. And to your point again, we're in the middle of a project where we're trying to save the planet for our grandchildren and their children. And that does mean that we're thinking in a generational, century-long timeframes right now. And so this is something that's evolving. We just haven't really been thinking like that as a society very much, certainly in the last 40 years or so. And so there's an opportunity to think differently about this and to really plan this in a way that is that realizes these benefits in the long term as well as the short term.
We have to start including the saved costs of climate change as offsetting to the investments in these. It would be much easier just to make a carbon tax.
A lot of people say that. I
Yeah.
hear you.
I think I am going to put a halt for the moment to the questions. There's still one or two more questions that people want to ask. I understand that, but I think we should get to the rest of the presentation, and then we'll have a chance to discuss everything that Eric's going to be saying later.
All right. Thank you, Tony. So we'll move
Yep.
forward here. And I like these numbers because I can remember them. And so they're good enough, in my opinion. They're reasonably accurate. The Biden-Harris administration has a goal of 30 gigawatts by 2030. That's about the same as New England's electricity generation capacity. So 30 is a good number for us to remember. In my opinion, we need to get to at least 300 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2050. That's over $1 trillion investment. And we're going to need at least 3,000 gigawatts of wind and solar to deliver the energy transition for the United States. So you can see these orders of magnitude playing out. You can see that offshore wind, even at $1 trillion investment, and as important as it is in our part of the world, still a relatively small part of the overall energy transition. And I've often been asked, why is it so important? Why do we care about it so much? Well, one, it's happening in our backyard, and it's our renewable energy form of choice on the East Coast right now. And number two, offshore wind has this really nice ability to bring the energy transition into focus. All the different aspects of how complex the energy transition are become visible in offshore wind, because you can sort of see all of these things coming together, and you can see the engineering and the policy and the transmission and the structures and the ocean and the animals and the whales all sort of inhabiting these same spaces. And so offshore wind is this very effective way to understand the larger energy transition, in my opinion. 3,000 gigawatts is about triple our current electricity generation capacity in the United States. So let's talk about this for a minute. Let's say we want to think about the entire United States, and we just go to the Energy Information Administration, look up 2020 electricity retail sales. 2020 is a nice round number. We're about 4,000 terawatt hours. So we're going to round 3,718 terawatt hours per year, right? We pay bills in kilowatt hours, and the nation consumes electricity in terawatt hours. We're going to round that up to 4,000 terawatt hours. Then we're going to say, let's say that our electricity consumption doubles because we get electric vehicles and we electrify heat. Again, we're keeping this really simple. You could say it doubles to 8,000. You could say it triples to 12,000. Both are reasonable estimates, depending on the way in which one is framing an analysis. And then we say, well, the year has 8,760 hours. Right now, 4,000 terawatt hours divided by 8760 is about a 45% average capacity factor. In other words, we use about half of our generation capacity at any given time. And so if you look up how much electricity New England is consuming right now, it's somewhere between about a third and a half of our generation capacity. So these are good rules of thumb to keep track of the size. Now, if we double the electricity demand by 2050, why do we go to 3,000 gigawatts and not 2,000 gigawatts? And that's because of these capacity factors. So if you see up here, imagine we have 1,700 gigawatts of solar. That is a lot of solar. At a 25% average annual capacity factor, that gets us just under 4,000 terawatt hours. We have 1,000 gigawatts of wind, land-based wind, at a 35% capacity factor. That gets us 3,000 terawatt hours. We add 300 gigawatts of offshore wind at a 50% capacity factor. Offshore wind has a very high capacity factor, and we get an additional 1,300 terawatt hours, and that's how we get to 8,000. Even though we tripled the gigawatts, we doubled the terawatt hours. So that's just kind of a helpful way to make sense out of these things. And you can look at these resource maps and you can say, well, there's a lot of wind on the Great Plains. Why don't we just fill it up with wind turbines and we can ship all this out to the coasts? Transmission is difficult to permit. And so it's really hard to make this happen. Eventually, we are going to need transmission crisscrossing the country in what we call a macro grid, but we're not going to get there before we need to build all this other stuff out. And we have a lot of solar in the southwestern desert. Can't we share this across the country? We'll come back to this notion of sharing. But this sort of brings up this question of a very interesting exercise. You know, anybody can sit down with these maps of the country and start to imagine, well, what are the regions and what kind of resources would we be procuring in these different parts of the world, different parts of the country? And then we think about the Western Interconnect and the Eastern Interconnect and the reliability councils and ERCOT. And then we think about how the ISOs and the regional transmission organizations are actually different than the reliability councils. And you see all of these different ways, you know, including in addition to state boundaries, how our country is divided up into different regions. And one begins to get curious, well, then how do you figure out how much we're going to be procuring? You know, where did I get the 300 gigawatt number? And these are the results of an exercise that we did. I did with some colleagues at Anbaric in 2020. Many of you may know Ed Krapels. We lost him a few years ago. Sadly, he passed away as a real leader in offshore wind transmission. And I was working with him and the Brattle Group and some of his colleagues on coming out of the pandemic. You know, how could we imagine a stimulus package that would really build an offshore industry? And so we were coming up with some of these numbers. And this was an exercise that I realized was a very interesting exercise. I turned it into a homework assignment that I assigned in my class on the energy transition. And this is homework assignment 1. Everybody draws a map of the country. Everybody calculates the gigawatts and the terawatt hours. We double the 2020 demand to get the 2050 demand. And you can see the number of different ways that people will divide up the country and think about this. And so this becomes this very interesting question to ask. And this is not a question that can be answered by any particular analysis. If you start to read the Pathways to 2050 literature, you could spend the next 3 years, you know, immersing yourself in books that, you know, stack 6 or 7 feet high, and then they'll say different things and they will change. And you start to realize, well, you know, for the average citizen, we have to pull out what are the meaningful aspects of this energy transition that we keep track of. And it really comes down to how many turbines and solar cells and nuclear power plants and all these different things are we building? And the other question is whose backyard are we building them in? Because they're going to get built somewhere, and they already exist in someone's backyard. And so if we come back to New England, here you can see, I like to show these maps drawn by hand just to kind of bring all this down to earth here. I was looking at retail sales in 2020. Massachusetts produced about 22 terawatt hours, and we consumed about 50. So we're an importer of electricity. If we take New England, New York, New Jersey, we come up with about just under 9% of the United States and less than 1% of the entire world. So yes, it's important that we reach our climate goals. But even if we successfully reach our climate goals by 2050, we really haven't made much of a dent in the global climate crisis. So I think this is really important for a region of the world and a region of the country such as ours that is so full of human and natural and financial resources. We really need to be thinking about how can we do more than our fair share, and delivering the energy transition in our backyard, in my opinion, is really about gaining the experience of how do we want to do this right so that we can help the whole world transition. And when we do this, we want to do it well. We want to do it sustainably. We want to do it in a way that doesn't just cut carbon down to zero, but that realizes our ideals of social and environmental justice. And that is something that, again, our grandchildren and their children are proud of. So I'm going to stop again on the energy transition. We'll just pause here for a moment, and then we'll go into a specific discussion of offshore wind and kind of wind up the presentation with some ideas about a future-oriented approach and understanding of this industry, which we're really just in the early days of. And so we're on the we're on the threshold of enormous creative potential on all levels of society, political, economic, social, engineering. It's a very exciting time, and this is something we really need to all be passionate about sharing with the generations that are following us, who are going to help deliver this transition.
Okay, great. Thanks, Eric, so far. I know that Ed Wool and who was it? Alan Fierce before had some questions. Alan, do you still have your question?
Yeah, actually, the slide that's up right now kind of is a lead into that, because there's what I think is the first reference to Northern Europe or here in today's talk. I was just interested in getting some comparisons to where we are versus where they are in Northern Europe, where I know they have had a considerable head start with their offshore wind program. And with respect to the size of what we're building off New England, is it comparable? Are we state of the art now and building bigger fields and towers than they are in Northern Europe? Just can you give us kind of a comparison?
Sure. Where we are right now, the Vineyard Wind turbines, again, are among the largest turbines in the Western Hemisphere. They're comparable to the turbines being built out by Equinor on the Dogger Bank. Those are also GE Haliade-X turbines, 13 megawatt turbines. And so I think, my shorthand is that right now, 15 megawatts is kind of the turbine that everybody's using to design. And people talk about growing, they talk about making them bigger. In my opinion, in the opinion of several other people in the industry, it would be just fine if we stopped at 15 megawatts. These things have gotten so big. The turbines, most of the turbines in the North Sea are 3.6 megawatt turbines. That was really the workhorse turbine for a long time. There are a lot of 7 and 8 megawatt turbines. For a long time, the Vestas 7 megawatt platform was then upscaled to 8, 9, and 10 megawatts. It didn't change the rotor diameter. It just changed the generation capacity, which meant that the rated wind speed went up. And so most of the turbines in Northern Europe are a lot smaller than the ones that we're building right now. And it's good for us to remember that, that here we are building these original wind farms with some of the largest wind turbines in the world, in the US.
Okay. And Ed Wool, you had a question?
Thank you, Tony. Thank you, Eric. This has been a terrific, very informative. My question relates to storage. To what extent is storage tied into wind, one, decrease the price or affect the price? And if you look at the wind and the storage together, is that a more efficient capacity factor? And does it then enhance the combination to reduce the variability of wind?
Sure. Thank you for that question. Storage is really important for these variable energy resources because we can't control when the sun shines and when the wind blows. And if it's blowing when we don't need any more power, we don't want to just not harness it or curtail the power. We want to be able to store it somewhere. And then we'd like to be able to use that storage when it's not blowing and we need the electricity. Interesting things about storage is there's storage on a daily basis. And a lot of people talk about using electric vehicles as widespread storage for that and battery storage and so forth. And then there's storage on a seasonal basis. And seasonal storage is kind of a different animal than, let's say, daily storage. And this notion of storage, a lot of times we default to thinking about batteries, but there are plenty of ways to store energy. One of them, there's a pumped hydro facility in Massachusetts. Another way to think about it is the development of green hydrogen using electrolysis to produce hydrogen. Right now, that's not considered very efficient, but there are cases where you could make the case that electricity prices are so high or the differentials in prices are so extreme that theoretically you could make a business case for that. So as we move once we get past 50% renewables penetration, by our estimation, we're really going to need storage on a large scale. In these early days, where we're still on the East Coast, not at a very high level of penetration, the storage is not that important from a practical point of view, but it's important from the point of view that we have to get ready for it. So I think storage and transmission really go hand in hand. They can accomplish similar things. We're also going to need a transmission network that can share power across the country, because of differences in time zones and weather patterns. And so I think that the name of the game is you've got these energy resources that we don't have control over when they happen, and we're trying to harness them. And they're also far away from load centers. And between those two facts, it makes you realize that a piece of coal, as done with coal as we are, is kind of this fascinating way of storing a lot of energy in an extremely efficient way. And then you can build a big pile of it and you can put it down close to your city. And you can see why it was so attractive to power things for that long the way that we did. So we're really taking on a more difficult engineering problem, but one could say that we have the tools to do it now that we didn't have 200 years ago or 100 years ago.
You look at current batteries as short-term storage. I'm talking about lithium or iron oxide batteries.
Yeah, batteries are it's not really my area of expertise, but my understanding is they're more on the short term. And I think the thing that I think about, that I'm drawn to when thinking about batteries, is the rare earth metals and the amount of human rights violations that are involved in sort of the mining of those. And this, as a civil engineer, I think about scale and this question of if we're thinking about thousands of terawatt hours, I'm skeptical right now that we can have that kind of a high-tech solution at that scale. So I'm a little more drawn to things like electrolysis. The ideas of how would we convert that to ammonia? How would we use the existing oil and gas infrastructure worldwide to transport, carbon-free synthetic fuels? And so I think, to me, this winds up being a question of scale. On a microgrid scale, batteries are fantastic, and batteries plus solar cells can create a really, self-sufficient neighborhoods that can be independent from the grid. And there are so many successful stories. And so a colleague of mine and I were contemplating the number of different scales. There were about 7 orders of magnitude, right? 10 to the 7th power difference in scale between the scale at which he was thinking, the scale that I was thinking when I was thinking about the country and he was thinking about neighborhoods in Vermont. And so I think all of these scales are relevant. And for me, it's very helpful from an intellectual framework point of view to be conscious of what scale am I working on at the moment, and then what does it mean when I traverse to a new scale, and are the people I'm talking with, are we all on the same page with each other when we do
that? Great, Eric. Thank you. I'm going to first ask if you want to address this question for Andy. There was another question similar. How do you design for the larger storms expected from climate change?
The storms aren't really what's driving the design of the turbines, interestingly enough. What's driving the design of the turbines is the fact that they kind of vibrate back and forth consistently over, years and decades. It's called fatigue. And so once you get past 25 meters per second or just over, 50, 60 miles an hour wind, you park the turbine, you feather the blades, and then these turbines are capable of weathering really large storms. And one could ask the question, well, what happened in Puerto Rico where all those turbines, got destroyed during, I believe it was Hurricane Maria. And these are some questions that there are a lot of really competent researchers working on. But when you look at the loads from the hurricanes and you look at the bigger storms that are coming, the intensity, the frequency of the storms is rising. The intensity of the storms in terms of benchmarks and what we design for, we already designed for very large storms. So generally, the hurricane risk is not seen from a structural damage point of view as being a real driver in the design, even though a lot of people have thought that. But we've done, a lot of work over the last 10 years to investigate that. One of the questions I think for storms is people are kind of asking, well, how much of the energy generation is going to go out in any particular storm, and then how do you turn it off and how do you start that up again? So there's certainly a lot of issues to work on. And there are a lot of really competent research teams, putting their heads together on these questions.
Great. Why don't we do one more question for the moment, Eric? Are there anticipated innovations that could transform the grid for delivery from these new energy sources?
That's a great question. So that makes me want to jump into the rest of the presentation. That's where I'll wind up. So if I may, Tony, I'm going to proceed and sort of focus on offshore wind and then focus on some issues that we think are very important in terms of delivering this larger system of the energy transition, and how does offshore wind fit into that? you mind if I proceed?
Sorry, yes, I said that sounds good, yes.
All right. So it's good to know kind of what we're working with from a resource point of view. The International Energy Agency published in 2019 the Offshore Wind Outlook and basically said, look, there's enough offshore wind in the world to power the whole world 11 times over in 2040. So this is a big resource. This is a growing industry. We are the early days globally of this industry. And even though, as we've observed, we're several decades behind Europe, we're still in the very early days of this industry. And so there's an opportunity not only to develop our own supply chain and manufacturing, but to think about how do we play in the global market. One of the amazing things that's happened in the last several years, if you see here, the time frame in question is 2014, the year that Cape Wind was about to stage. We had just finished the Marine Commerce Terminal for Cape Wind, and then they lost their power purchase agreement at the end of that year to 2019. The size of the turbines grew by more than a factor of 3, and the price came down by more than a factor of 3. That shattered all expectations. There was no one who was thinking that the size was going to go up that fast, the price was going to come down that fast. People didn't think we were going to get below $100 a megawatt hour before 2020 in Europe, let alone in the United States. So when we ask about, is the energy transition possible, it feels so big. We feel so small. Yet the things that we've been living through in recent memory are so big that no one could contemplate them even a couple of years before they happened. And so the way that I share this with my students is I think that we're living in a historic moment. And in this, and in a historic moment when really big things are happening, again, we see very high highs, we see very low lows. It can be very difficult to make sense out of things. But if all you do is look back over the last 5 years and say, how much has the world changed? And you really look at the facts, it's incredible to see how much this industry has grown. And so this is what we're living in the middle of. At the same time, we're retiring a lot of our fossil fuel power plants. In New England, we're retiring up to 30% of all of our fossil fuel power plants. This is 2017. This is the Brayton Point coal pile, a 680,000 ton coal pile being drawn down for the last time. What an incredible thing to have retired these power plants, to have retired the Filthy Five. Those cooling towers were built in 2010. They were destroyed in 2022. Hundreds of millions of dollars of investment. I mean, these are the kind of dramatic things that are changing quickly in our midst. In addition to our offshore wind resource and our expensive electricity, we also have all of these very interesting power plants and substations right on the coast. In fact, these were known as the Filthy Five. Mount Tom, Salem, Mystic, Canal, and Brayton Point. I added Pilgrim in there as well. It's a nuclear power plant. These have all been retired. And these are the places where we can plug in. New England has better points of interconnection than anywhere else on the East Coast. And we'll talk about this a little further. And so we have these ready-made points of entry to the grid as we launch this industry. And so one of the interesting things that we think that we've kind of missed an opportunity in terms of, we meaning the larger New England and the state of Massachusetts, we've missed an opportunity in terms of messaging, is what's really happening is not just that we're digging up, I'm not doing this, but developers are digging up Covell's Beach right now. Okay. And if I'm on Covell's Beach, my children play on that beach and I don't know what's going on, I'm going to think, my God, what are these people doing? They're putting this gigantic cable under my beach. This is awful. I feel like I don't have a say in this. And how do I make sense out of all of this? And it would be a lot easier to make sense out of this if we had just torn down a giant smoky coal-fired power plant and then brought the cable in underground into some green grass field. And that's really, if you zoom out far enough, that's what's happening. We have retired the worst power plants in our system, the ones that were creating polluted air. The air is cleaner in New England than it has been in decades. And we're missing the opportunity to understand this narrative as we have succeeded. We should be celebrating in the retirement and the decommissioning of these old power plants and bringing in the new clean energy. And so this is something that I think groups like yours and everyone really needs to be involved in. And what is the story? What scale are we telling the story on? How do we understand the story? And how do we feel like this is our story that we share? Because the only way that we're going to accomplish the energy transition is together. This is Salem. I love this quote from the Conservation Law Foundation. You know, Salem Harbor Station's plume can be seen for miles as its trail of black soot stretches across the region. 2010. That wasn't too long ago. That really wasn't too long ago. And so the old Footprint Power Station, a lot of colleagues in the Salem Alliance for the Environment fought to get that power station decommissioned for a long time with very powerful allies. There's a new power station there, much cleaner, natural gas. And this is a success story to get rid of that level of pollution. But there's this question, you know, now there's a new wind farm south of Nantucket. You can see it from the beach. You can see it at night. It's a big deal, you know, to people who really haven't thought about living next to a power plant. And do they feel like they have a choice? And I think a lot of us are familiar with the reactions to these offshore wind developments. Massachusetts has a long history of engaging in all of these discussions. And right now there's a group on Nantucket. I don't really understand the name of the group, but it's Act4 Whales, and they've brought this lawsuit, all that they're going to bring it to the Supreme Court, saying that the way that Vineyard Wind was permitted violated the Endangered Species Act. And so we also know that this is a playbook that has been developed in Massachusetts for over 20 years, most notably developed in Cape Wind, which we can see some very unlikely partnerships emerged during that time. I don't know whether Ted Kennedy and Bill Koch ever actually got together personally and talked to each other about this, but they ultimately wound up being allies, you know, behind the Alliance to Protect Nantucket Sound, which levied 26 lawsuits against Cape Wind. Jim Gordon and his team won every lawsuit. Ultimately, we can all have our opinions about Cape Wind and are we relieved that it didn't get built or not, or what all these things. But during that time, the whole process for permitting offshore wind in coastal waters, the playbook for fighting it, you know, the not in my backyard, or as some people say, the not in my second backyard approach to all of this was developed. And so as we're talking about community engagement, this is not something new. Massachusetts knows this very well, and we have a very long history to draw on to try to figure out, well, then how do we locate ourselves so that we can have a reasonable, engaged, you know, good faith conversation about how are we going to live with the places and the machines and the plants that produce the power that we depend on a daily basis and we take for granted. North Atlantic right whales. This is an image from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. There are only 360 right whales left, approximately. And most of the threats, the reason the right whales are dying, are from vessel strikes and fishing entanglements. And so if you want an interesting perspective on right whales and offshore wind, I think it's reasonable to assert that offshore wind has done more good for the North Atlantic right whale than any other phenomenon that we've seen in our lifetimes. The amount of attention that the animals are getting now is really the attention that they deserve. The wind industry so far is not what's killing the right whales. And also we're bringing attention to, you know, we have 400 years of use of our coastal waters. When I understand anecdotally that when Vineyard Wind was cleaning up the blade debris, which again should never have happened, okay, but they were cleaning up the blade debris on the bottom of the ocean, they also decided to clean up all the other debris they saw. And I encouraged them, I said, you know, you should take a photo of, there's the blade debris and then there's all the other debris. And my understanding is that there was a lot more debris already sitting there. Our coastal waters, what's going on under the ocean, our ocean already needs help.